My name is Abner Akam, a sports enthusiast and an aspiring journalist. I used to think that I had a future in sport, but things do not always work out as you hope. Back when I was in high school, I played almost all the sports my school had to offer. Cricket was my favorite. But because I am colored and grew up in the colored township, things were quite difficult for me. I had to walk about 10 k's to school to get to decent sports facilities. My parents couldn't always afford my sports gear. I had to avoid the peer pressures of smoking and drinking to focus on sports. I had to be careful walking in the street because you never know what lurks around the corners. And just when you feel like you are getting somewhere, you get judged because of the color of your skin, which is what happened to me when I got selected as a filler to represent the Eastern Province Under-13 cricket side. I batted as low as 10 and didn't bowl at all.
Keep it that way right until the end. 2, 3, stay!
At the time, I was reasonably happy about making the provincial cricket side, so the effects of being selected on the basis of a filler did not affect me too much. But looking back now, and taking into consideration what I've learned academically, it is very disappointing that these things still occur in this day and age. It is hard enough for a township boy to make an effort and go the extra mile to make it on the sports front. The last thing he needs is for his skin color and social background to be determining factors. Maybe mine was just a once-off incident, but I was quite keen to find out if other sportsmen of color went through anything similar. South Africa is one of the continent's greatest success stories, especially in the sporting arena. I came across a video clip of the 1995 Rugby World Cup held in South Africa. The scenes of happiness were certainly something you would want to be a part of. To me, it seemed like a major turning point for what South Africa would later become. One united country, filled with equity and equal opportunity for success.
Ik was 17 jaar oud. Alles het kwaai gelijk, man. Die land het as een gekom, is allemaal bij elkaar gestaan. Ik moet terugdenken, zou ik denken dat het zou beter gaan met die racial issues.
If we review our decision and accept the Springbok for rugby as our symbol, we will unite the country.
This is our best time. We're very proud of him and very proud of the box.
It should have by now been together, South Africa, but at the moment sport is actually splitting us up into white and black.
Unfortunately, in our country, everything goes back to the superior being and feeling inferior.
By proclaiming the message of one team, one country, rugby in South Africa, once a symbol of division and exclusion, had indeed crossed the threshold to a new era of a united and reconciled nation.
After closer inspection, despite the scenes of unity, it was difficult to imagine a lot of change when there was only one black player representing the Springboks in that tournament. I traveled around South Africa and got in touch with a friend of mine, Eusebius Mckaiser, a fellow Grahamstownian, a man who was also affected by the corruption of the apartheid system, but has now made a name for himself as a political analyst who specializes in race and racism.
When we talk about sport in South Africa, sport is often seen as escapism. Sport is seen as galvanizing us across our racial differences. We don't like to problematize sport because we like to go to sport as our safety from racism, and then we become denialist about how unreformed sporting codes are in South Africa, because we want sport to be the one place where we can be all kumbaya, there's lots of gees, and because sport has that kind of role in South African memory going back most recently to 1995, We don't want to ask hard questions about sport because we want sport to be a space that is different to the rest of society. But that is a lie. It can't be. I think there's a massive myth we need to slay. Sport has never unified South Africans. We think that when black and white people sit on crates together in a shebeen in Soweto, that means that we are now unified.
Eusebius raises some interesting points. The fact that people view sport as an escape from racism and racial issues casts a shadow on the deeper problems in sports. People often wonder why there are not enough black people representing sports teams. Well, the politics and economic inequalities in sports are central to this debate. I made a stop in the Eastern Cape. Port Elizabeth and Grahamstown is where I came across three gentlemen who I have known for quite some time now. They have had similar experiences to mine, and as keen sportsmen, they are trying to manage and cope with the ripple effects the apartheid system has had on their lives.
Ek was 16, 17 toe ek begin cricket speel. Ek was al op hoërskool. Ons maar altyd in die straat gespeel. Die ouens het maar in die straat gery. Maar nooit vir die skool toe ek self gespeel. Ek het maar altyd gaan kyk. En maar my eie balletjie gehou. Ek meen, as er verskil tussen 'n tennisbal en 'n rooi leerbal, ek meen, ons is meer comfortable met die tennisbal in die straat. En het was moeilik. As ek moet terugdink, jy miskien teen die wat skole kon speel. As speel jy teen, die ons is altyd 'n step ahead of jou. Die ons kry coaching. Ek meen, ons oefen in die straat, ons doen al self. As jy leiding, jy moet jouself leer en jouself on top kry daar. So elke keer jy maar gespeel het teen 'n ander skool of so, dan was daar maar mense wat altyd maar hulle doubt gehad het teenoor jou.
I think it's more difficult for black people making it sport, or people come from the township making it sport, than people who've kind of had everything on a platter for them. And sometimes, for example, in cricket, the bat to use has to be of high quality for you to get the best results. You can't use a cashmere wood to hit a big six. You need an English willow who's has been through a lot, and you know these things are quite costly in this day and age.
Hockey is an amateur sport, so there's no funding. So you actually have to pay for your way forward, and lots of non-white people can't afford even a hockey stick. A decent hockey stick will cost you 3,000 rand. So your parents are struggling to pay for your school fees. They won't be able to fund your hockey equipment, never let alone the hockey tours that the kids need to go on.
As ek in begin met facilities, baie moeilik. In die colored area waar ek groot raak, is die oval. Ja, mense vandag is ons op die oval sportfaciliteit in Grahamstown. So jy wat ons groot raak, die het ons cricket geoefend, maar hier is daar hulle basies niks aan nie. Die rede van dit is die faciliteite nie. So jy kan self sien hierso. Dis 'n mat. Die mat is nie 'n cricketmat, die was opgetel in die straat en maar gebring hier net toe. Om te bou hierso. Vir instance hierso. Okay, as jy die kraak kan gaan sien hierso. As op 'n goeie lengte was die bal hier land, jy wat kof hierso. As hy is toe. Ek kan nie veel vertel wat kan gebeur met jou nie, jy sal weet. Die fencing, die draad. Bottelstukke. Dan sien die bottelstukke. Agter self was eens regte paaltjies soos op maar kratte. Destyds is kratte gebruik, maar daar is basies niemand in die plek. As jy die moeite werd met, so kom jy van jy leer niks. As niks om te leer hier nie.
It was quite difficult trying to get proper facilities in terms of my school's like 8 k's away. So I had no other choice to come here to these nets.
I'll show you a perfect example, like a Julian Ikes, for instance. He is South Africa's main goal scorer at the moment. He's going to the World Cup. He went to a non-white school in East London. And throughout his schooling career, people didn't realize the potential he has because he wasn't able to train on a facility like this here. And then eventually when he got used to the facilities and the idea of playing on the AstroTurf, he's one of the best strikers that our country will see for a long time.
Economic inequalities seem to be a major barrier for these young men. Not only do they need it for facilities, equipment, and coaching, but it also stands in the way of their talents getting recognized. Working twice or even 3 times as hard seems to be the only way forward for young black sportsmen in this country. In my opinion, these sorts of inequalities are forms of subtle racisms that only people of color can understand, because racism can sometimes be a feeling that you can't put into exact words. These subtle racisms also breed other subtle racisms and can affect the way in which people treat you. When former Springbok World Player of the Year, Ashwin Willemse, walked off set on SuperSport, I could fully sympathize with him.
I think it's important for me because, I've played this game for a long time. Like all of us here, I think, And as a player, I was labeled a quota player for a long time. And I've earned hard and worked hard to earn my own respect in this game. So I'm not going to be patronized by 2 individuals that have played in an apartheid, a segregated era, and come and want to undermine, And so I think for me, I've had my fair share. I can't work with people that undermine other people, and you can sit and you can laugh about it, but you know exactly what happened. It's fine. I don't mind it being ridiculous. I'm glad it happens on air so people can see, because you two sit here. No, it's fine.
There have been times where I would have loved to do something similar, like when I get questioned for walking around the white suburbs to go to practice, or when I got teased for not having nice equipment. Unfortunately, I didn't have the courage that Ashwin had. The thing is, when you're a person of color, I guess you get used to these sorts of things and they become part of everyday life. So it becomes a matter of preparing yourself, because you're expecting subtle racisms to occur. Back in Johannesburg, Eusebius tries to give us a sense of what I was speaking about earlier. The subtleties of racism and the fine lines involved that can be easily missed. People have to take into consideration people's historical backgrounds before making certain decisions and acting on them.
Racism isn't always explicit, and when it comes to South African sport, the culture of exclusion can be very hard to diagnose as racist, but it's very real. I think there's a direct, a very obvious, and an underexplored link between economic inequality in society and racism in sport and exclusion in sport in South Africa. If we don't deal with racism, especially subtle forms of racism, I don't think it's subtle, but people like to talk about subtle racism, then sport will continue to be exclusionary. If you take cricket, even more than rugby, it's very difficult to fit in as a township kid going to a private school like Kingswood College or St Andrews College in Grahamstown if you don't understand the culture inside the locker room. And those cultures are based on British values, British ways of doing things, handed down by the colonialists who come to Southern Africa, and they inculcate a certain way of playing the sport, the idea of being a gentleman, being in your whites, having tea. You don't have amagwinya or vet cook during that time, you have tea. So that's not explicit racism. Explicit racism is when you say to a guy, hey, you kafir, you're not going to bowl me out.
As I headed back to the Eastern Cape, Eusebius' thoughts were still fresh on my mind. And so I wondered if Melo, Odwa or Joan have had exclusionary experiences in sport.
Ek kan terugdink as toe die eerste keer by 'n hotel kom. Ek meen, jy kom nou in die hotel, as ons skielik wit lakens, as wit kombers, ek meen daar is nie sulke goede mense hier. Jy skrik, die oggend ons gaan eet, as 'n variety van kos. Ons is nie goed gewoond nie. Jy weet nie eens waar om te begin nie. As ek moet praat van eet, jy weet jy begin daar en van een punt werk. Jy gryp enige ding wat daar voor jou is. Het was nie 'n maklike aanpassing hier, regtig. As jy in die kleedkamer kom byvoorbeeld, jy meeste wag aan die ouens hulle spyse vat en dan moet jy maar waar daar 'n oop gaatjie is, gaan sit. Kom John.
Personally, I feel that exclusion is one of the things that go hand in hand with stereotypes. I mentioned before that it was difficult for me to walk to sports practices, not only because of the distance, but because of the judgments and stereotypes that people have developed about people of color.
Het al een paar keer gebeurd, als ik begin te oefenen, dan rijden mensen bij het even mensen gestopt ook al. Vraag wat dan zie maar, hoe zie kom. Ik ben die voelt ja, en zoals ik zei, je moet maar nou net rijden bij die ene oor en bij de andere oor. Maar het is een moeilijke ding. Het is baie moeilijk om voor die jongere geslag zulke goed te kunnen verduidelijken. Want je loopt hier een wit area en je wordt maar gekeken alsof je nou weer gaan inwerken. Het zal altijd daar wees, ik meen. Het is een moeilijke enetjie, maar ons moet met het leven.
These sorts of things can be psychologically damaging. A typical stereotype of a sportsman of color, not mentioned by Melo, is the label of being a quota. And again, these ideas that people form about you affects the way in which you are treated.
I won't mention names and institutions. There was a stage when I was at high school where I did doubt whether I was good enough to play because a person of a different skin color was preferred to me at that point in time with a specific coach. I won't mention his name either, but when time did go past, I actually made it further than what that person made it in sport. Yeah, there were stages in the beginning when I made the national team where we would swap, a non-white would swap with a non-white player because it just happened that way. And we weren't entrusted to all play at the same time. It's always just 1 for 1 and never 3 or 4 of us playing on the field at the same time. So those small things people think it just happened, but when you're sitting on the side you say, but why is he coming off? Why can't we get an opportunity to play together? The guys that understand each other, they're too scared that if that connection happens on the field, it's a connection that you can't then separate. I actually wanted to quit the sport, and it takes a lot to actually motivate yourself to wanting to play that sport again.
Unfortunately, I have felt like a quota. It was at a national tournament where I was selected as a batsman. Ended up batting at a national week. I think you have to play 75% of the games. So I had to play certain games. And I remember getting selected as batting a 9. Didn't bowl, but I just had to be in the team. So they complied with what has happened. And that's where I felt most as just there to fill up the numbers. In relation with the quotas and my performances, unfortunately, they had a negative reflection on my performances. I think I was quite young at the stage. Obviously, didn't expect these things that early in my life. I felt out of place, to be honest. And I just tried to look at the positives around me, which was just happy making a national tournament and playing against certain players. So without a doubt, that has had a negative effect of my early career. I feel some of us don't really realize how this has impacted a young boy growing up in the township, having dreams to becoming a Protea.
The reason why we need to talk about what racism means, particularly the culture and the norms that aren't always as explicit as the worst forms of racism, is that it becomes exclusionary in ways that are very difficult to detect if you are not very good at detecting the different ways in which racism operates. How many people go directly from a township school and eventually making it into club rugby or cricket and into the provincial teams? Very, very few. And what excludes them is not talent. What excludes them is they're just not the right kind of darkie. You're not the right kind of black. We see it in coaching, we see it in the selections processes. If you've gone to St. Stitians, like Kagiso, you've got a better chance of fitting into the culture. Unless you think white people are born with greater innate ability or talent than black people, then it has to be the case that if everyone had equal opportunities, that all of our national sporting teams will reflect the demographics of the country. So my challenge to people who think that there is a meritocracy in sport is, are you prepared to accept that what you are implying is that black people are born with poor genes? And if you don't accept that black people's genes are inferior, then you have to admit that unequal opportunities is the real reason why 50% of the team could be white, even though fewer than 10% of the population are white.
I've learned quite a lot during this journey. Amongst other things, I have learned that my experiences were not isolated incidents, and that there are other sportsmen of color who go through similar things. There are many factors that stand in the way of our success. The funding, facilities, stereotypes, and subtle racisms is just the tip of the iceberg. It's the sad reality, but what can we do but live through it? We hang on to bits of hope where we can, just to get us over the next hurdle. But we know there are still plenty of other hurdles to jump over. Perhaps we will overcome them all one day.